Hello again. Well, today's my last day as the Takeover week. I hope you've enjoyed the series. Oh, and we still have the one more video, but I do hope you've taken some interesting things away, learnt something, maybe found something that you might adapt to your next project. Today I'm going to take the quilt that we've finished up to ironing down the applique yesterday, and I'm going to do a bit of stitching on it. So some hand stitching and then the machine applique quilting, and of course finishing off the binding. So I'm going to take you through a couple of different techniques, show you some basic embroidery stitches that are really good for filling in a vast array of different projects, quilts, bags, all sorts of things. Especially if you're after something a bit random or a bit ad hoc, or you don't want to be overly structured. So I'll show you that first up. Then we're going to stitch down the applique, and then I'm going to finish up showing you how I completely cheat with binding. Alright, we'll see you shortly. The next stage of our piece, before I go on and do the quilting and the stitching around the flowers, is that I want to do a little bit of embroidery just in the gaps. Just not a huge amount, but areas like this, where we've got no flowers and no feature elements like the bees. And I've selected a couple of the wonderful pearl cotton number 8s in colours that I think complement the piece quite nicely. I'm only going to do 2 very basic stitches on this, and I'm not going to do an awful lot, just enough to give it a little bit more texture. So this is colour 126. Right, I'll just tie a knot on the end of my threads and we'll be good to go. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is just a couple of clusters of French knots. So, for those of you that don't know how to do a French knot, hold the thread with your thumb, take the needle and wrap it once around your needle, and then push it through close to where you came up. I'll do this again once it's easier to see, and just ease it through. So up through the fabric, one wrap, and back down through the fabric. See how I'm holding my thread here? That's what gives the tension to the French knot. And you don't want to be pulling it too tight, you just want to be easing it into itself, so that you've got the French knots. So I'm just going to do little clusters of 5 or 6 of these all over the piece, just to give it a little bit more texture. So once around the cotton, once around the needle, back through and pull it down. And we just scatter these randomly. I'm not necessarily planning where I'm putting them, I just want to create some more randomized texture all over the piece. Try not to be too lined up or conforming, like we talked about with the paint elements. That's starting to look a little bit like they're all lined up, so I'm going to go over to the side. And keep going. Alright, so you can see fairly consistent because I've done the same thing. There's a little cluster of 6, and I never work in even numbers because there's very little in nature that has an even number, so I'm going to do a 7th one here, and then I'm going to keep moving across the piece with the French knots. So I'll probably do 5 or 6 clusters all over the areas around my bees, and to highlight around the flowers. So although the colours, you can see the colours very similar to my background, which is quite intentional, you'll get this subliminal effect of all the texture as it starts to go. And I want to do this embroidery stitching before I do the quilting, because then all my threads and knots and things will be in my quilt sandwich, not on the back of my quilting. So you might want to use a hoop if you find that you need to. I tend not to in this sort of ad hoc type of stitching, simply because I find like I don't necessarily need it, but I also find that I can move more freely if I'm just not using a hoop, and I can keep going and do as many or as few of these as I want. So you can double your thread, and I'll show you some double thread in a second. I'll just do a couple more here. And by doubling your thread, you're going to make a much fatter French knot. Now remember, it's only ever one wrap around the needle for a French knot. If you start doing multiple wraps, you're actually creating some sort of bullion, and not a very formed up one. So I'll just do a couple more of these, and then I'll show you what the double up thread looks like. And these are just subtle texture. Talked about right from the very beginning, creating lots and lots of layers of lots of different textures, and these different textural elements give you that effect. Okay, so I'm just going to tie that off, and then I want to show you the double thread. In this case, with the slightly different colour, the 410, slightly darker, I'm actually going to do a double thread. I could change to a heavier weight thread if I wanted to, or I could just do this. So tying my knot with the 2 threads at the end. So that means automatically when I put my French knots in, I've got twice the weight of the thread. So if I, again holding my 2 threads there, 2 strands, one wrap around the needle, back down through, hold it taut until we get to this point, and there you can see that the French knot is much bigger. So I'll do a couple more of those around this area as well. So once around, back on down, pull it tight. And so on. So again, different contrasting size of French knots will give us different contrasting texture on the background piece. And by changing up the colour, I've also put some more detail in there. So I'll keep going across the whole piece. I'm not going to sit here and show you the whole things. The second type of stitching I'm going to do is a seed stitch, and it's another one that you just want to put randomly across the whole piece. So I'm going to leave that now and come back to that. So I'm just going to put this needle in here. I'll come around to another area and come back to my original thread. Now I'm just working on 2 colours with my embroidery. You can put more in if you wanted. And once I've quilted all of the flowers down, I'm probably going to use some of the beads that I put into the 3D pieces in some of the centres, or I could do some more randomised embroidery depending on what the mood strikes me. Just depends. I like beads in the centre because it's nice and dimensional. Now with seed stitch, what it is a series of straight stitches. So just a whole series of little straight stitches, but unlike a really structured piece of embroidery, you scatter them all over the area. So you don't want to be all lined up, you want it to be quite random. As a general rule, you should try and keep the stitches about the same size, in the same way as if you were a packet of flower seeds or vegetable seeds and scattering them across your ground. And it's really just a matter of up and down. And filling the space. But make sure you keep it randomised. That last stitch was a bit too small because I did it in a bit too big because I did it the wrong way. I did it in a cheats way. Just keep working across the area. Fill the whole area. And change the direction of each of the stitches as you go. In this way I can also change my colour if I wanted to introduce the other thread and alternate some of the areas of stitch. You can do that. It just comes down to what you want the surface to look like. So I'm just going to keep filling this, and it's a really good filler for just areas, and it doesn't matter, you don't have to have a boundary, you don't have to have a start and finish, you can just keep going until you've covered as much of the area as you want. And it's a really quick and easy way to put some embroidery stitching and some texture onto a piece. So hopefully you can all see that. Just up and down and up and down. And you can do this in front of the TV or in the car waiting to pick up kids from sport or at the hairdressers or any number of places. Don't need a lot of tools, just your thread, scissors and your needle, and it just gives you a lot of texture. So I'll just keep doing that over the course of the afternoon. The next stage of putting this whole piece together is the quilting, and I've already basted my 3 layers together. So I have my background, my wadding and the top, and I have started doing some of the quilting. Now I'm very lazy, so the less steps I can take in any process, the happier I am. And I like to do my quilting and my applique stitching at the same time, because that's one less lot of stitching. So everything I do, well not everything, but generally what I do is I will put everything together to the point that you saw it yesterday, and then I will make up the quilt sandwich and baste and stitch all in one go. Now most people traditionally do a blanket stitch or some sort of decorative stitch around their applique. I don't particularly like that for the style of work that I do. So what I tend to do rather than blanket stitch is I will do a straight stitch just around the edges of whatever element I'm sewing. This is more than enough to hold everything in place. The double-sided web on the back will stabilise the fabric and hold it down, and then that stitching just creates the final bond. There is no requirement to do more unless you choose to. Right. Now I'm using my second machine here today because in the COVID environment I've not been able to get my number one machine serviced, so it's a little clunky. This machine is well over 20, oh yeah, it'd be 20 years old or very close to it, maybe 18. But it's a workhorse and I love it, and I pull it out whenever I need it. It had been sitting in the shed for over 5 years before I last used it, so it is quite a machine. Anyway, you will hear a bit of clunkiness. Just try and look past that as I work around. So if you've got the capacity to put your needle down, then make sure that it stops in the down position, and that way it makes it a lot easier. Now we're not really free motion quilting per se, it's more that we're stitching around the edges like following a line. And when you've got lots of curves, you just need to do it nice and slowly. I've not dropped the feed dogs, but I have reduced the pressure of the feed dogs. Again, your machine may be able to do that or may not. Now I'm going particularly slow because I'm talking to you as well, and I do want to show you what I'm doing. And just like that, I've gone a little bit too far, but it won't matter. You can always unpick it if you don't like the stitching. But to be honest, I very rarely will do that. So just slowly work your way around the edges of the flower or whatever shape it is that you're stitching. And there's really not much else you need to know. Sometimes I will use my machine to stitch centres into the flowers. I don't want to do that on this piece, but I might find one where I've done that somewhere else and show you a picture of what I'm talking about. But this piece I don't want to do that. I'm going to put the purple beads in the centres of most of the flowers. So I'm just going to show you one flower because, quite frankly, it's going to get quite tedious. And there's really only so much I can say about it. And, sorry, great deal of concentration going on here. So I'll just stitch the one flower for you to see. You can get a general idea of what I do and why I do it. And if you choose to make a similar piece, you can either machine or hand stitch, depending entirely on what you prefer. But as I said, I like this because it means my quilting is getting done at the same time. So I'll finish stitching all the rest of these elements and bring you back to show you my binding once all the quilting is done. So I've got a little bit of a cheat's way of doing a binding, certainly for small pieces, but that's what we'll do next. Right. As you can see, I've stitched all of the applique elements down. I've done some basic quilting on the piece, and now I'm ready to finish it off. Now I've jumped a step in the videoing of this, mainly because it was pretty boring. But I've sewn my binding onto the quilt top. What I've done though is that I'm using a really lazy way of stitching, and I'm going to machine stitch my binding down. So I'm being a bit lazy, as I said before, don't see any point in doing something I don't have to. So one of the issues with machine stitching binding is often that it slips and moves and you don't get a very accurate finish, and the binding looks pretty messy and can be lumpy and all sorts of things go wrong. What I've done is I have taken my fusible thread and I have put it onto my bobbin. So when I stitched my binding onto my quilt top, going along the edge, I had normal cotton in the top of the machine and the fusible thread in the bobbin. So on the back is the exposed fusible thread. Then when I fold my binding over and give it a press, it's now lightly bonded to the fusible thread. It's not a strong enough hold to last forever. It keeps it steady so that I can create a binding that's machine sewn and tight, and it won't slip or move. Now I'm using this foot here, which is not the 1/4 inch, it's the top stitch foot, and I'm just going to keep it just on the inside of where the binding sits. So I'm stitching right on the edge of the binding, and it's going to give me this wonderful finish that will catch the back and stitch the binding in place. So I've not had to baste my quilt. I've not had to pin it pin the binding down or anything like that. I'm just simply stitching along the edge of the binding. And it's going to give me a finish. Now another option is to position your machine needle so that it sits just in the ditch. But I actually want the frame of the stitching to be part of the binding. And there we have it. We've finished our quilt top. A couple of ends just to tidy up and I'm good to go. But you can see that I've stitched around the inside, and on the back it's caught my binding quite safely without a great deal of work. What do you think of our finished quilt? I hope you like it. From a piece of white homespun to this, it's quite a transformation, isn't it? Across the week, I've shown you pretty much what I run through in a lot of the classes I teach when I'm overseas. So I hope you enjoyed that very much. If you're interested in completing a project like this, I have a discount on the paints, and I also have put together some kits for this particular piece. The applique flower fabrics will vary from kit to kit, but the colours will be very similar. I've painted backgrounds so that all you have to do is the embellishment, so you can skip what we did in lesson 1 and have a bit more fun. You've got some sample size pots of the Lumiere paint, the transfer artist paper, a roll of the fusible thread, foils and tissue paper. So everything you need to get started if you wanted to create something like this. Otherwise, join my Facebook page, keep an eye out on what we're doing there. There's new stuff coming up regularly. I'm going to start doing weekly specials post live, so join me on Instagram or Facebook if you've not already. And thanks for taking the time to watch me. Bye.